Hello everyone, I'm Nasser Ali Afza, and this presentation is a brief account where we would explore what is scientific writing and how it should be approached. The aim is to enable the listener to become a successful scientific writer. The presentation would cite my personal experiences, my own examples from my own publications, and a reflection where the important points will be discussed regarding the one's journey to become a successful scientific writer. So let's start. All right. So in this um, video, we will focus on an important part of the manuscript, which is material and method. As I said, material and method, or sometimes patience and methods, is the part where the experimental conditions, the actual settings, the conditions under which the experiments, the study was conducted are given and detailed. So after, say for example, after scientific deliberation and proper reasoning, if you devise a hypothesis, but don't adopt, and if you fail to adopt, for example, the proper methodology to test your hypothesis, then everything becomes irrelevant and futile. So this part is very important. So material methods or patience and methods is a part where the key elements of the study design are included, as I said earlier. One should describe the design itself. What is the study type, location of the experiments and study, and the periods of recruitment of the patients and conduction of the experiments themselves, exposure of the groups, whether one is, for example, there is a case and there is a control, so you need to define the exposure itself. And in longitudinal studies, of course, the follow-up needs to be mentioned here, the conditions of the follow-up, the duration of the follow-up, and what in follow-up was actually followed up, and of course, how the data was collected. For example, on a survey, on a specialized tool, or recorded utilizing certain scientific equipment or what. And of course, the characteristics of the participants of the study should be clearly defined. For example, what is meant by the cases and what is meant by the controls, what is meant by the exposure group, exposed, what is meant by unexposed, and so on. What are the group definitions, to be really honest? And then the eligibility criteria, which population was able to register for this study, and after the ones who were registered, which ones and of the population of the participants were actually included or excluded. So there are set criteria. Well, this is the eligible group, people to, for this study. But then, out of these eligible ones, how the inclusion and exclusion was decided. For example, if a study is conducted on maternal health, all right, among mothers, of course, the male population is excluded. They are not eligible actually. So the eligible would be mothers to be or mothers already, and then of course, rest of the females and other gender, the males would be not eligible to participate. And after the eligibility has been decided and the cohort or the population is already inducted, uh, how really the inclusion was made, which group of the uh, public population was actually included and which one was excluded. And well, it is difficult really to ensure that the sample size is always calculated, because there are some studies where sample size is irrelevant. But anyhow, wherever relevant and applicable and possible, the sample size needs to be calculated, and the sample size needs to be described, how the calculation was made, which method was used, and so on. So we continue with material and method here. So one has to define the outcomes. All right. For example, if you are treating a disease with an antibiotic, an infection with an antibiotic, for example, the outcome could be the absence of the infection after the treatment. So the outcome would be, say, for example, being afebrile. If it is a lung infection, improvement in oxygen saturation. All right. And the secondary outcomes would be something like subjective feeling of being good, being able to walk around without much support, and so on. So it depends. What are your primary goals in the study, and what are the additional goals? So you need to define primary outcomes and any other relevant outcomes, which may not be primary but of interest. All right. Then one has to define what an exposure would be, and how it would be defined. What would be counted as a proper exposure. For example, as I mentioned, an antibiotic here. All right. So what dose, what duration, all right? Which antibiotic, all right? If it's a group, what are the different antibiotics within that group, at what doses, which are equivalent to each other, and what duration. Okay. Then predictors, as much as possible. Then potential confounders. For example, in the same example, say if someone has got multiple infections apart from that particular bacterial pathogen of interest, someone may also have a concomitant viral infection or a fungal infection. Now that particular patient would be a problem. So no, those extra issues may be confounders. Diabetes may be a confounder. All right. Any other drug which affects the plasma levels of that particular antibiotic, all right, may be a confounder. So anything which can affect the ultimate outcome would be a confounder. So a predictor, factors which predict the outcome, confounder, which will, the factors which could potentially influence the outcome, and effect modifiers, the ones where, a confounder and an effect modifier are a bit different. But let's see if we could define it more precisely. So one should also make an effort to give diagnostic or pathognomonic features or classification criteria, whatever is applicable. So the classification, the identification of the group is very important. And the experimental details which are relevant to that particular study should also be given. If the method is well documented already, then you could cite that well, we conducted the experiments as described by ABC, XYZ, and et al., something like that. So, material method continue here. One should also describe the statistical methods used to compare the subgroups and any interactions between the subgroups. All right, because that is very important. If data is good but the statistical methodology adopted is poor, the results may not be relevant. They may actually be misleading. All right. Some statistical methods, they actually create more problems than solutions. So one has to be very much careful about that you select the proper and relevant statistical methods. Well, if there are problems with that particular statistical method and there is no choice but to pick that particular one should always mention it as a potential bias and need to be part of the manuscript. For example, you could also you could define it within the statistical analysis or within the discussion section, and it's usually at the choice of the researcher. One should also mention discrete and continuous variables. What are the ones where the variables are measured and the variables which are counted, for example? And we'll also need a specific description of the methods of the analysis. That is very important. All right. So, and ultimately, we should also mention the level of significance. Usually the p-value less than 0.05 is considered significant. All right. So that is something which one should always mention. Otherwise, there are studies where a p-value less than 0.1 may also be significant, or 0.01 may be significant. So again, it becomes of a concern. Usually, most of the times, it is the level of significance is determined like a p-value less than 0.05. All right, one should also explain how the missing data, if any, were addressed, because that becomes sometimes very relevant in terms of studies where a certain outcome is expected, and because of the missing, one or two values, that particular part of the chunk of the data may not be addressed properly, and this may actually change the results. So one has to be very much clear about it. Now, here is an example. This is also one of my publications where you will see that the methods are quite elaborately defined and described. Whatever we discussed in the previous slides, that is quite well included in this. For example, in the first paragraph, you would see the settings, the participants, the criteria, etc. This one, the experimental details, which primers were addressed, which primers were used to conduct the experiments, and so on. And here is the statistical analysis. So thank you very much. We are thankful for your interest in the presentation. If you have any further queries or any points you would like to discuss even in much more detail and depth, don't shy away to write your comments, your questions to the email address given here, and I'll be happy to answer all of them. Thank you so much.